Hello again, everyone. We are back on YouTube and LinkedIn, bringing you yet another exciting episode of the Top Innovator series. This is where we dive into proven leadership ideas, game-changing strategies, and of course, the brilliant minds behind them. My name is Joseph Martins, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest today. With us today is Charles Griffith. Charles is Senior Partner and CTO with Infinite Corridor Group, a consulting firm in the supply chain industry. Before that, he held tech executive positions in a variety of other organizations, and we're thrilled to have him with us today. Charles, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. And as I said, leading into this, I may be more of an example of what not to do than what to do. So
Yeah,
excited to be here.
you mentioned that in the short conversation we had before. So I'm super curious to hear some of these stories. So it's about leadership, right? When you reflect on your journey, when you ask yourself, how did I get to where I am today? What are some of the ingredients? What are some of the contributors to the success that you had, Charles?
I think the first thing is that early on in your career, and we have a lot of people that are starting out at a very interesting time trying to find their way, both because of the geopolitical environment and because of, just the transition in technology and where things are. The most important thing is I learned a lot by changing jobs multiple times. See, the goal is to do that early in the career and
Yeah.
not in the end of the career, I suppose. But learning different cultures, processes, businesses is critical. So that was kind of a formative foundation. And then later on, as I went through those journeys, if you have the right aspirational goals and so forth, you want to help others, you start to learn how to become more of a leader, and you start to find your way. Of course, there are a lot of pitfalls and mistakes along that way. And as you continue to try to become a bigger and bigger leader, there are different types of challenges at each of those plateaus.
So many different companies going from one company to another. Talk to me a bit about sort of, not about specific companies, but what
Sure.
did you look for to make this a rounded portfolio? Or maybe it's not one, maybe it's more randomness or serendipity. But I wonder, is there maybe sort of, were you looking for cultural richness, for geographic companies, industries? And I'm not suggesting there is one, maybe it's random, but I'd be curious
Right.
to hear more about that range of
Well,
what you were looking for.
I went through a number of different types of companies. So early on in my career, I did video games, which I won't say any of them are good. I take a lot of beatings in YouTube still defending or educating others on what not to do there. But that took me to a variety of different parts of the U.S. So one of the things I learned early on is you can't put roots down and expect to grow as a leader or even as an engineer. Many times you have to be very fungible and move around. The world's changed post COVID. There's more of more
Correct.
infrastructure to support the ability to work anywhere than there was when I obviously was coming up. But I found that to be good because, the many of these companies are a microcosm of where they evolved from. So you get a completely different living environment, new set of people, et cetera, as you move. So early on with video games, then I started to move into more entrepreneurial areas. So I started with CAD, which doesn't sound entrepreneurial at all, but that was going through kind of
Yep.
a modernization, moved into other areas that were moving towards, kind of a SaaS-based role, things like encryption and so forth, and then into payments. And spent a lot of time in that area as digital payments started to grow before going to Amazon. So I intentionally started to broaden myself in terms of types of companies and types of businesses because I realized my ultimate goal was really to be an entrepreneur and to
Okay.
fill in the gaps that I had from being too deep in one particular area. So that was kind of an intentional decision.
Interesting. Okay, got it. So you had this idea of entrepreneurship, of starting running your own company at some point, and there were puzzle pieces that were needed for that. That's
I
how
learned that through
okay.
failure, by the way, through trying to do some of my own companies, for example, in games. Many of the lessons you learn as a leader, not to be too focused on a single customer, for example. I learned that early on. Learning that you have to have a diverse team, not just in terms of roles and abilities, but even locations and aspirations. So some of those came through early failures as a leader for small entrepreneurial adventures. And then, as you start to move into some of these other areas, when I started to move into CAD CAM, for example, I started to encounter people that were in a much older demographic than I was. And games was a very young industry
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And so everyone was young and crazy. So starting to get some
Mm.
stability and some differences of perspective from people in different stages of life became very important as a leader. You started to realize everyone is not the same as you, right? Which is one
Yep.
of the first breakthroughs as a leader. And in fact, I find a lot of failed leaders are exactly for that reason, right? They want everyone to be
Mm.
them, as opposed to
Interesting.
figuring out how to get the best out of different types of people and different
Yeah.
perspectives.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. When you again think back to your journey, think back to the different evolutions or steps that you took, what was something that surprised you? What was a leadership moment, so not technology, not products, but a leadership moment where you thought, I have an idea of how this is going to work, how the situation is going to unfold, and it was different?
Oh, I think one of the first times that happened was when I had a major change in terms of role where I led a lot of different types of disciplines. In other words, not just a pure engineering group. I had
Mm-hmm.
support. I had a lot of different customer service. And what surprised me, I think the breakthrough there was, not everyone is tuned and dedicated to their job at the same rate. Engineers
Mm.
very, very typically are deep thinkers. They're very motivated. They're very focused on goals and solving problems, whereas other people are basically, may or may not be that dedicated. They may be thinking, not that there aren't people in customer service or in support or others that aren't equally deep. I've seen that many times, right? But the diversity of motivation starts to become an issue. And if
Mm.
you're the coach, in this case, it was more of a player coach before I became kind of just stepped away and became the leader of the organization. You start to make, plans based on a level set of what you can get out of, or you believe you can get out of all of these various divisions. And when you find that that is critically flawed, it's a
Yep.
massive epiphany. And it drives you to become a lot more empathetic. It
Hmm.
drives you to have a personal change in terms of how you think about not just an organization, but how you go back to your roots of thinking of each individual as opposed to just, titles and groups.
Yep.
And I think that's the difference between a good leader and a bad leader. A bad leader takes a set of functional outputs for a particular group and tries to drive them to those metrics, whereas a good leader looks at the individuals and how can they get the best out of each one of them inside of their functional areas. And then you start to see
Nice.
innovation across different divisions as opposed to, people just, working
Yep.
to a particular planned event.
Yep. Yep. That's nice. Really looking at the individuals and what they are able to contribute. And I think it's also always a question worth asking. What does this unique group of people, what are they able to do that no other group is able to create, just based on the constellation that we have here? That's a neat perspective. Hmm.
I think the other thing is as you start to interact locally with individuals and when you start to level set and explain to the organization what you can do, it's more inspiring to people, right? Someone who understands the team can get more out of a team than someone who just sets, company directive. And I mean,
Yep.
it sounds obvious when you say it, but when you actually execute like that,
Yep.
it's a
Yep.
transformation for an organization that's never done it. And there are many out there that haven't.
Is that something that you knew all along? Is this something that was clear to you, or did you have? Okay, there's a story.
Absolutely
Okay,
not. No,
tell the
I
story.
had to fail. I had to fail in the situation before I could learn. Now, the question is, can you fail and recover quickly? And can you prevent? I think failure is great. You learn more from a failure than a success, for sure. The question is whether you can recover from it and not make the same failure twice. if you learn from your failures, they're lessons. If you continue to fail, those are critical HR issues, and you don't want to run into those.
Okay. Now, let me take a different look at your leadership journey. I'm sure you had trusted advisors by your side, you had mentors, you had people who were just following you on the journey. What was some advice that you got from them that really stuck with you?
Oh, the interesting thing is some people have formal mentors. The type of mentors that I had were the people that I kind of navigated to based on a number of things, right? You can find people that are sagely that you're working alongside, and people have no idea why do you respect that person's opinion? I've run into people who, because of where they are in life, whether, they're just doing this particular job while they work towards the next one. You can figure that out if you speak to the people and you understand what their true motivation is. So, long story short, I had one particular mentor who he'd figured out how to come to the U.S. He'd come from Russia. He was one of these guys that had the ability to look at a problem in a completely different way than I ever could, and he could come up with an instant game plan. And he had a lot of different insights and perspectives in terms of how to think and how to regulate the way that you communicated with the rest of the organization. In other words, I like to play things close to, I like to basically be very transparent, but that's not always the right thing to do, especially inside of a very political organization. And so maybe coming from his cultural upbringing, he knew that implicitly,
Interesting.
but he knew how to not allow that to hinder his ability to work with the team. And so that was something I took away from that particular mentor, along with many, many other lessons, as an example. Other mentors and aspirational thinkers I saw throughout, especially Amazon. Amazon early on hired a lot of people that were very disparate in terms of background. They were all very successful. They all had one thing in common, was that they could deliver at a high clip, and that was about it, right? You'd look at this collection of people, you go, what do they have in common? And it really was just the desire for Amazon to succeed, which looks like it's a pretty successful strategy. So within that, I had a number of different people that I saw, both on the business and technology side, especially on the operations side, and an understanding of how to really work with different groups of people to, change the way things were done. The hardest thing, I think, as a leader is to convince people to do something a completely different way. And that is something on the operations side at Amazon. They had some very good leaders, from Jeff Wilke through Marco Netto, that took them through a culture of, first of all, instituting more of a Six Sigma type of culture, to then introducing lean. And those are big shifts in organizations, but each one was required for a different stage of growth. And so looking at how that was rolled out at a large organization and how they made that happen, both at a local level with operators and with leaders of those groups, was a huge part of, how I think about leading organizations.
Yeah. Now, we talked about the past of your leadership journey. I'd like to take a look at where you are today. And again, not a question about company, not about title
Sure.
or anything like that. When you look at where you are at the moment in your leadership journey, what's an area where you feel you can grow? What's an area where you think there is room, there is more to be had?
First of all, the answer is everywhere. If you're listening to feedback, one of the things that I believe is, it's almost like sports. And I'm going to use a basketball analogy, for example. You can't be Phil Jackson and go in and run, the triangle offense with a different team every time. He was pretty successful. But nonetheless, as a leader, you have to constantly change your strategy by company. And so I find that the biggest thing that, as I change companies, or I change now that I'm doing more of a consulting at the tail end of my career, the most effective thing you can do is listen and adapt. And so where I find the biggest challenge is not to jump to conclusions too quickly and to listen to the organization. Why is the organization like this? What were the reasons that it grew in this direction? And are these constraints or are these things that can be changed? And so I find that's the area where I'm constantly learning, and especially from a people perspective, right? Are they in this particular situation because they have a set of people that believe strongly in one particular direction, and they could be changed to think about it differently coming from an outsider's perspective? Or is it truly because that industry has to think that way? So those types of things where you're, again, translating the intent and the abilities of a team to a strategy, I find that's the area where I'm constantly learning.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I imagine this letting go of some expertise to some extent, not focusing on expertise, is particularly challenged in the tech sector because we're so used to leading with expertise. We're so used to having answers. Is that fair to say?
Surprisingly, I'd say yes and no.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think lesser and lesser. I think that as we're going through this entire transition in AI, it's becoming less about what you know and how you think. I think that earlier on in my journey, even as an engineer, where languages were changing every couple of years, right? We start with
Yeah.
C, then we go to C++, where you go through this epiphany of thinking in terms of from functional to a kind of a class level to Java and so forth, where you had to constantly forget what you knew and reinvent yourself. I find that that's something that I have had to do repetitively. But when you're struck with something that seems completely wrong, that's a time when I say, what am I doing wrong, right? Why is this industry that's been successful or this company that's been successful for 30 or 50 years been so successful? Is it because they've been lucky, they've had market share, or is it because there's something that I need to learn here before I make a recommendation or before, I do something to
Yeah.
contribute to their success?
Yeah. Yeah. Charles, let me ask you one last question to complete our conversation. When you look at other leaders in technology and you could change one thing, let's say you have a magic wand, you can wave the magic wand and something would change in the way tech leaders operate. What would that be?
Wow. I think, first of all, I think that the most important thing is I do feel that most tech leaders have moved away from people, and maybe it's built into us, and been too focused on the technology and less on the bridging and bringing along the team and the organization. I think ensuring that empathy gene is still there after leaders grow. A lot of what we see, whether it's news media or those of us who've been in these various companies, is many times people become widgets as people grow in their career. So my magic wand would go over all of these people and remind them that there's a human component in every equation. And don't forget that, because you're actually limiting the output rather than improving it.
Yeah. Charles, thank you so much. Been an absolute pleasure to have you in the conversation. Many things I will come back of. I was tempted the whole time to ask you for the biggest fail story. I felt like you were almost asking me, but I didn't do it because I thought I'd keep it to that. Thank you so much, Charles. Been
Thank
awesome.
you, Joseph.
To everyone else out there, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and most importantly, join us again for our next episode of the Top Innovator series. And until then, keep your brain cells active.